The North Atlantic Ocean was not merely a body of water during the Second World War, it was the world's most crucial and contested battlefield. Every ton of food, every gallon of oil, and every piece of military hardware required by Great Britain and later the Allied forces had to cross this treacherous expanse. The very survival of the island nation depended entirely upon the safe arrival of cargo ships originating primarily from North America. This logistical challenge created an inherent vulnerability that the German Kriegsmarine was determined to exploit with brutal efficiency. German Admiral Karl Donitz correctly identified that strangling the sea lanes was the most effective way to defeat Britain before America could fully mobilize its vast industrial power. The campaign waged by his U-boats, the infamous wolf packs, became known as the Battle of the Atlantic, a conflict spanning the entire war and claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. It was a campaign of attrition, where the total number of ships sunk slowly chipped away at the Allied ability to wage war on the European mainland. The men who sailed the freighter ships, the merchant mariners, were instantly thrust onto the front lines of this relentless naval warfare. These slow, often unarmed vessels were essentially targets carrying irreplaceable resources through an ocean teeming with unseen predators. The journey was a constant, nerve-wracking gamble with very long odds of survival. Early in the war, the technology for detecting and engaging submerged submarines was rudimentary and unreliable, giving the U-boats an enormous advantage. The vastness of the ocean itself provided the perfect cover for the German hunters to operate with near impunity against the vital stream of Allied supply. The German U-boat, short for Unterseeboot, represented the pinnacle of naval stealth and aggression in the early 20th century. These submarines were designed to operate on the surface using diesel engines for long-range travel and then submerge on electric power to execute their attacks. The typical Type 7 U-boat was a robust and simple design, capable of diving quickly to evade counterattack once a torpedo had been fired. Life inside the U-boat was a miserable existence of damp air, diesel fumes, cramped quarters, and constant mechanical noise. Despite the hardships, the crews were highly trained and deeply committed to their mission of naval strangulation. They operated under the wolf pack doctrine, where groups of U-boats would patrol assigned sectors and then converge on a detected convoy en masse. This collective hunting strategy overwhelmed the meager defensive escort ships of the early convoys, ensuring a high sinking rate. The preferred tactic was always to attack at night, surfacing to achieve maximum speed and accuracy while minimizing the risk of detection by radar or patrolling aircraft. The sight of a U-boat on the surface, silhouetted by the moon against a storm-tossed sea, was a terrifying image for any merchant sailor. Torpedoes would often strike with devastating force, sometimes causing freighters carrying explosive cargo to vanish almost instantly. The success of the U-boat arm became a powerful propaganda tool for the Nazi regime, symbolizing their defiance of the combined naval power of the Allies. But every successful torpedo strike was a personal tragedy for the Allied crews, a blow against the war effort, and a sign that the very fabric of the supply lines was fraying. The early sinkings created a profound crisis in Washington and London, demanding an immediate and effective response to stop the slaughter. The initial shock of the war on the American coastline revealed a stunning degree of unpreparedness for the submarine threat. Following the U.S. entry into the conflict, German U-boats were immediately sent to the North American seaboard to take advantage of the chaos. This period was tragically dubbed the Second Happy Time by the German submariners for the ease with which they found and sank their targets. Coastal cities, complacent in their distance from the European war, continued to operate with lights blazing, brightly silhouetting passing merchant ships for the U-boats offshore. Naval patrols were scarce, and coordination between the different branches of the American military was notoriously poor. Tankers carrying vital oil from the Gulf of Mexico were sunk within sight of the beaches of Florida and New Jersey. The sight of burning ships and oil slicks became an uncomfortably common occurrence for residents of coastal towns. The U.S. Navy had insufficient numbers of escort vessels to form effective convoys and lacked the experience necessary to conduct coordinated anti-submarine warfare. Many destroyers and corvettes that could have been used for defense were committed to distant theaters or were still under construction in the rapidly expanding shipyards. The German captains found it almost a pleasure cruise, picking off ships one by one as they were unable to defend themselves effectively. This period of vulnerability was a stark and humiliating lesson in the modern realities of total naval war for the American defense establishment. It demonstrated that the conflict was not confined to Europe. The war had arrived directly at the American doorstep with terrible force. The urgency to develop and deploy effective countermeasures grew exponentially with every new shipping loss reported in the daily naval updates. The initial years of the Battle of the Atlantic, particularly from 1940 to 1942, are marked by the unparalleled triumph of the German U-boat. This era was grimly referred to by the German crews as the happy time, a period of abundant targets and minimal resistance. The convoy system, while eventually effective, took time to organize and implement across the vastness of the sea lanes. When convoys did sail, they often lacked sufficient escorts, creating weak points that the U-boats were adept at exploiting under cover of darkness. A single U-boat sighting a large convoy could summon an entire wolf pack to the area using coordinated radio signals. The ensuing surface battle in the moonlit ocean was frequently one-sided, with merchant ships being torpedoed one after another. The statistics from this period are sobering, with hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping sinking to the bottom every single month. Britain's reserves of food, fuel, and raw materials dwindled perilously close to the critical point required for national self-sufficiency and war production. The psychological impact on the sailors was immense, as they knew they were sailing into a lottery of survival with the odds stacked against them. Survivors often faced the immediate danger of freezing in the frigid North Atlantic waters or falling victim to the U-boat's deck guns. The German strategy of unrestricted submarine warfare was proving devastatingly effective at isolating and weakening the Allied war machine. This sustained period of success fueled the confidence of the German naval command and led to a massive expansion of the U-boat building program. The Allies were forced into a desperate race to produce more ships than the Germans could sink, a race they were initially losing at a concerning rate. The only immediate and viable defensive strategy against the relentless U-boat threat was the mass adoption of the convoy system. Convoying was an ancient naval tactic, but its execution on the scale of the Battle of the Atlantic was a logistical marvel. It involved grouping dozens, sometimes over 100, of merchant ships together for mutual protection across the entire ocean journey. The core principle was simple: it was harder for a U-boat to penetrate a concentrated defense than to pick off isolated targets. The escort group, usually comprised of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, would ring the convoy, constantly searching for submerged U-boats with their limited sonar equipment. The presence of the escorts forced the U-boats to remain submerged for longer periods, significantly slowing their speed and reducing the time they could spend actively hunting. The introduction of very long-range patrol aircraft, particularly the American B-24 Liberator, helped to close the crucial mid-Atlantic gap where air cover was previously impossible. These aircraft acted as an extended deterrent, forcing U-boats to dive and preventing them from shadowing convoys on the surface during the day. While convoys were attacked, the sinking rate per ship traveling in a convoy was dramatically lower than for ships sailing independently. The organization and administration of the convoys required complex international coordination between the British Admiralty and the US Navy. The escort commanders developed highly specialized and aggressive tactics to drive off the wolf packs, learning from every engagement and adapting rapidly. Life aboard the escort ships was brutal, involving non-stop vigilance, constant exposure to the elements, and the strain of being the only hope for hundreds of men on the freighters. The convoy system ultimately transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a U-boat shooting gallery into a series of tense, desperate struggles for survival. For the early years of anti-submarine warfare, the primary and virtually only weapon against a submerged U-boat was the conventional depth charge. A depth charge was essentially a large barrel of high explosive, preset to detonate at a specific depth and then rolled off the stern of the attacking warship. The core problem with the depth charge was that it required the attacking ship to pass directly over the submarine before dropping the weapon. This meant that the attacker lost sonar contact with the U-boat just as the attack run began, creating a critical blind spot in the ship's final approach. The U-boat captain, once contact was lost, could execute a rapid turn or change depth, often escaping the lethal blast radius entirely. The weapon's effectiveness relied on a near-direct hit or a very close explosion to crush the U-boat's pressure hull with a hydraulic shock wave. A typical attack run involved a high-speed pass, a drop, and then a tense wait for the explosion, which was as terrifying for the attackers as it was for the intended target. Many U-boats survived sustained depth charge attacks, albeit with severe damage, which became a common experience for veteran German crews. The escorts often had to drop patterns of dozens of depth charges in an area where they thought the submarine might be, wasting valuable explosive material. The process of reloading the depth charge rails and throwers was arduous and dangerous, often performed on a pitching, wave-swept deck. The German submariners developed a healthy respect for the sustained terror of a depth charge run but also learned to exploit the limitations of the weapon. The conventional depth charge was ultimately a weapon of harassment and deterrence rather than a reliably lethal weapon system. It could force a U-boat to dive deeper or flee the area, but it seldom guaranteed a confirmed kill without a prolonged and lucky engagement. The frustration with the low kill rate of depth charges galvanized the need for a completely new anti-submarine technology. The prevailing technology of the time imposed severe limitations on the Allied ability to hunt and destroy the silent, submerged U-boats. The primary detection tool was ASDIC, the British acronym for Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, which was the predecessor to modern sonar. ASDIC worked by emitting a pulse of sound and listening for an echo from a solid object, such as a submarine hull. However, the technology was notoriously susceptible to false readings from temperature layers in the water, wave action, and schools of fish. Once a U-boat was detected, the attacking ship had to maintain a precise track, which became impossible when the U-boat changed course or depth. The inherent flaw in the depth charge attack run meant that the period of greatest vulnerability for the submarine coincided with the time when the escort was blind. This blind spot, often called the cone of silence, was a tactical gift to the U-boat captain, who would use it to their utmost advantage. To make matters worse, early escort vessels were often too slow to catch a U-boat running on the surface at night, and they lacked the maneuverability for precise attack patterns. The Wolfpack attacks, coordinated by radio, further exacerbated the problem by forcing escorts to defend against multiple threats simultaneously. A single escort could not possibly cover every possible angle of attack, leading to the devastating success of the German strategy. The sheer difficulty of confirming a kill after a depth charge attack also led to inaccurate reporting and a misleading sense of success. The Allied forces desperately needed a weapon that could strike forward, maintaining sonar contact with the target until the very moment of impact. This need for a revolutionary solution would drive the development of a completely new kind of anti-submarine weapon system. The tactical stalemate caused by the depth charge blind spot necessitated a radical rethinking of anti-submarine ordnance delivery. Naval engineers began to investigate a concept that had been briefly considered in the First World War but abandoned due to technical difficulties. The new idea was to launch a salvo of bombs forward from the escort vessel while it was still maintaining continuous ASDIC contact with the submerged target. This would eliminate the dreaded cone of silence, allowing the escort captain to adjust the attack right up until the moment of firing. The solution emerged in the form of a multiple spigot mortar system that was developed by the Royal Navy's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. This novel weapon was officially named the Hedgehog because its numerous launch barrels resembled the spines of the small, defensive animal. The Hedgehog was designed to fire a circular pattern of 24 small, contact-fused bombs ahead of the ship as it steamed toward the U-boat. Each projectile contained a relatively small amount of high explosive, but the revolutionary aspect was the contact fuse. Unlike a depth charge, the Hedgehog bombs would only detonate upon physically striking the pressure hull of the submarine. This contact detonation meant that if an explosion was heard, a U-boat kill was almost certainly achieved, eliminating the guesswork of the depth charge. The psychological impact on the German crews was enormous, as a Hedgehog attack either resulted in a silent miss or a catastrophic, unrecoverable strike. The weapon's design was simple, relying on the forward momentum of the attacking ship to carry the spread of projectiles forward over the target. It represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine tactics, moving away from harassment and toward guaranteed destruction. The Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar system was a marvel of elegant, yet brutal, simplicity and effectiveness. The launcher itself was a large, flat base plate mounted on the forecastle deck of a frigate or corvette, covered with multiple steel spigots. 24 cylindrical bombs were placed onto these spigots, each angled slightly to ensure a wide and evenly distributed elliptical pattern upon launch. The bombs were propelled by small cordite charges in the base of the spigot mortars, sending them flying approximately 200 yards ahead of the ship. The entire salvo was fired almost simultaneously with a single, massive, cracking sound, the projectiles arcing towards the water in a deadly spread. The key to the weapon was the contact fuse, which required the projectile to physically hit a solid object to detonate. This characteristic meant that if a Hedgehog salvo missed, it would simply sink harmlessly to the bottom without any explosive evidence of the attack. The lack of a non-lethal explosion was a huge advantage for the attacking vessel, as it allowed the ASDIC operator to maintain continuous contact. Unlike the deafening concussion of a depth charge, which temporarily blinded the sonar, a missed Hedgehog attack allowed the ship to immediately reset and attack again. The Hedgehog projectiles would hit the water and sink rapidly in their tight pattern, creating a lethal underwater minefield that the U-boat was already moving into. The system was quickly installed on a variety of escort vessels, transforming their offensive capability from passive defense to aggressive hunting. The training of the crews focused on perfect timing and coordination, ensuring that the projectiles were launched while the U-boat was still perfectly centered in the Aztec beam. The Hedgehog was a quiet, deadly revolution that permanently altered the balance of power in the undersea war. The tactical advantage of the Hedgehog rested entirely on the precision afforded by its ahead-throwing design. For the first time, an escort vessel could drive toward a confirmed submerged contact and fire a lethal salvo without losing the crucial sonar lock. The attack procedure was standardized. The escort would locate the U-boat, establish a firing solution, and then maintain a steady course and speed directly toward the target. The U-boat crew, accustomed to the blind chaos of a depth charge attack, found themselves under a new and more terrifying form of assault. They could hear the escort ship approaching on its screws, knowing the attacker could still track their slightest movements. When the Hedgehog fired, the entire 24-bomb pattern would splash down in a tight circle just ahead of the U-boat's projected position. The sheer density of the pattern meant that the chances of at least one projectile scoring a direct hit were remarkably high. If a hit occurred, the contact fuse instantly triggered a detonation, focusing the entire force of the explosion directly onto the U-boat's hull. This direct, point-blank explosion was far more effective at causing catastrophic damage than the distant, crushing shockwave of a depth charge. A successful Hedgehog attack frequently resulted in the U-boat breaking up and sinking almost immediately, with little chance of survival for the crew. The psychological warfare was also significant, as the German crews quickly realized that a Hedgehog attack was a final, often unavoidable, moment of judgment. The successful implementation of the weapon turned the hunters into the hunted, fundamentally changing the risk calculus for the U-boat commanders. The Hedgehog marked a strategic turning point where technology finally provided the Allied navies with a definitive answer to the submarine stealth. The introduction of the Hedgehog weapon coincided with the culmination of other key technological and tactical breakthroughs that collectively won the Battle of the Atlantic. By 1943, the combination of ultra-intelligence decoding, longer-range aircraft, more escorts, and the devastating Hedgehog proved overwhelming for the U-boats. The German crew's happy time was definitively over, replaced by a new era of constant danger and rapidly rising losses. The Hedgehog's accurate, lethal capability dramatically increased the confirmed kill rate of U-boats compared to the old depth charge method. U-boat commanders soon reported that the old evasion techniques were no longer effective against the forward-throwing weapon. The number of Allied sinkings began to drop sharply, while the number of U-boats lost each month soared to unsustainable levels. This period became known as Black May of 1943, when the German U-boat arms suffered a crippling series of losses that effectively broke the back of the campaign. Admiral Donitz was forced to temporarily withdraw the majority of his remaining U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging the strategic defeat. The sustained Allied counteroffensive, anchored by reliable weapons like the Hedgehog, had succeeded in protecting the vital supply lines. The ability to transport men and material across the Atlantic was secured, paving the way for the eventual Allied invasion of Europe. The Hedgehog alone did not win the battle, but it was a crucial, devastating component in the comprehensive Allied strategy. Its legacy is that of a simple, ingenious device that effectively solved the fundamental technical challenge of anti-submarine warfare. It represented a moment in the war when the defender gained a decisive technological edge over the stealth of the attacker. The final victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was hard-won, secured by the sacrifices of thousands of Allied sailors and the deployment of brilliant technology. The Hedgehog weapon ultimately served as a powerful symbol of the ingenuity that allowed the Allies to adapt and overcome the U-boat threat. The German U-boats, once the terror of the sea, were systematically defeated and forced into a defensive, losing posture for the remainder of the war. Their initial freedom to hunt freighters with impunity was completely revoked by the superior combination of radar, air cover, and forward-firing weapons. The ability of the Allies to maintain a steady and massive flow of resources across the ocean was the critical foundation for the victory in all other theaters of the war. Without the safe arrival of those convoys, the subsequent invasions of North Africa and Europe would have been utterly impossible to stage. The development and adoption of the Hedgehog is a perfect case study in how a small, well-engineered technical innovation can have a disproportionately massive strategic impact. It allowed the escort commanders to engage U-boats with confidence, transforming their role from mere protectors into aggressive, successful hunters. The lessons learned from the design of the Hedgehog would go on to influence future generations of anti-submarine warfare technology globally. The men who sailed the corvettes and destroyers of the escort groups, who stood watch over the dark water, became the unsung heroes of the longest battle of the war. They secured the bridge of ships across the Atlantic, ensuring that the industrial might of America reached the fighting front. The quiet, contact-fused explosion of a Hedgehog was the sound of the pendulum swinging irrevocably in favor of the Allied cause. The sea lanes were finally made safe, and the lifeline to Britain, and ultimately to Europe, was permanently secured against the shadows of the deep.